Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Destiny Youth Bible Study. We are going to be covering chapters 37 through 50. So we are going to be finishing out the book of Genesis today, and we will go into Exodus in the next one. Very exciting. Today we are going to be looking through the story of Joseph and the formation of the 12 tribes of Israel through the sons of Jacob. So what I would love for you guys to do is, these are a lot of chapters, so we are going to be covering some of the main points of the chapters. Go back and read them on your own, read them as a family, read them together, but this is not for you to just hear the main points and then not have to read it. I want you to read it for yourself. So we are going to be reading from, I'll show you this. I have the Amplified version here, which is my favorite version, and then I have the ESV with historical context included here. If you are listening to the podcast, there will be a couple of times where I might show a map or I might show a chart of lineage. So I will do my best to describe that for you if you are listening solely on audio. But we are going to go ahead and get started. So Genesis chapter 37. This introduces us to Joseph, Jacob's second to last son. Many people know the story of Joseph and his multicolored garment, how his brothers betray him and sell him into slavery. So let's get started in 37. I'm going to go down to verse 2. So Joseph is out with his brothers, and then it says, we're already starting off with Joseph kind of being a self-righteous individual. It says he comes back from the fields and gives a bad report about his other brothers to his father. A lot of the times we look at the story of Joseph and then we think, oh, Joseph is the victim, which yes, he is in many ways. However, Joseph in this moment, and we're going to get into the dream, is very prideful. He is full of arrogance. Also, this is Jacob's favorite son. So, now Israel, Jacob, loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a distinctive multicolored tunic. His brothers saw that their father loved Joseph more than all of his brothers, so they hated him and could not find it within themselves to speak to him on friendly terms. So, imagine this. You are one of these other brothers. Picture this way. Your dad buys one of your siblings, not just a car. He buys them a Mercedes, brand new 2025 Mercedes. But then he says to you, oh yeah, you've got your own money. You can go buy your own car. These brothers are not happy with Joseph. So he has this coat, and then he goes and he has this dream. And he tells his brothers about the first one. The first one is this. He says, us brothers, were binding sheaves of grain stalks in the field. And lo, my sheaf suddenly got up and stood upright and remained standing. And then your sheaves all stood around my sheaf and then bowed down in respect. And his brothers said to him, are you actually going to reign over us? Are you really going to rule and govern us as your subjects? So they hated him even more for telling them about this dream and for his arrogant words. But Joseph dreamed still another dream and told it to his brothers as well. He said, see here, I have again dreamed a dream. And lo, this time I saw 11 stars and the sun and the moon bowed down in respect to me. He told this to his father as well. And then his father said, what is the meaning of this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow down to the ground in respect before you? Joseph's brothers were envious and jealous of him, but his father kept the words of Joseph in mind, wondering about their meaning. So a couple of things to point out here. Number one, Jacob says to Joseph, shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow down to the ground in respect before you? This is kind of a rebuke toward Joseph in a way. Sometimes God will give you dreams. Sometimes God will give you a word that is not something for you to share in arrogance. And that's kind of what happened in this scenario. So Jacob actually gives him a bit of a rebuke, saying, hey, cool it with this, but he still keeps it in his mind. So Jacob realizes, yeah, this is probably a word from the Lord. Let me keep it in mind. But Joseph, chill. So now his brothers hate him, and they go out to do their shepherding thing. And then Joseph goes to look for them one day, and they're at Dothan. So they're up north, past Shechem, so that they're in the northern part of Canaan. And then Joseph goes after them, and then he finds them at Dothan. And then in verse 18, we have the plot against Joseph. And take a sip of coffee real quick. Okay. And when they saw him from a distance, even before he came close to them, they plotted to kill him. They said to one another, look, here comes this dreamer. Now then, come and let us kill him and throw him into one of these pits. These pits were cisterns that were dug into the ground or into rock where they would collect water during the winter in the desert. But right now at this point, there is no water in this pit. Then we will say to our father, a wild animal killed and devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. Now Reuben the eldest heard this and rescued him from their hands and said, let us not take his life. Reuben said to them, do not shed his blood, but instead throw him alive into the pit that is here in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him to kill him. He said this so that he could rescue him from them and return him safely to his father. So we have Reuben, who is the firstborn of Jacob. Now, you might think, oh, Reuben's being nice. He's he really cares for Joseph. That's actually debatable, because what Reuben is doing here is he knows that Joseph is his father's favorite son. Reuben, in our last Bible study, several chapters ago, slept with his father's maid wife named Bilhah. So Reuben is not on good terms with his father. He committed a very immoral sin by sleeping with his father's wife. Now remember, Jacob marries Leah, but really wanted to marry Rachel. So he has Rachel and Leah, but then both Rachel and Leah had their maidservants. They had Jacob sleep with them as well to create more children, because they were in this fight between the two of wanting children. And Rachel, of course, did not have children until she had Joseph, and then later on Benjamin. Joseph was the 11th son, Benjamin was the 12th. But this is why there's so much favoritism toward Joseph, because he was the firstborn son of Rachel. So Reuben is actually plotting to get back on his father's good side. He's scheming. If I can save Joseph from all the other brothers who want to kill him and bring him back to daddy, then he's going to be so happy, and he's going to restore me back to the place that I need to be in as his firstborn son. So they throw him in the pit. And then it says in verse 25, then they sat down to eat their meal. So again here, this is underlying the callousness of his brothers because they have just thrown him in a pit. They have just plotted to kill Joseph, and now they're just going to sit down and have dinner. Completely calloused. When they looked up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, east of the Jordan, with their camels, bearing just a bunch of trade goods. But what's interesting here, the Ishmaelites, if you remember back to Abraham and Sarah, Sarah wants a child. God promises a child. And then she says, oh, Abraham, go and sleep with Hagar, my maidservant, so that I can have a child, which of course leads to the birth of Ishmael. Now, going back to that point where Hagar was given a promise by God, God promises her, you and your son will be free like the wild donkeys of the desert. You will be these free, nomadic people traveling all over the desert, doing whatever you want. Now, here are the Ishmaelites, who are the descendants of Ishmael, free, traveling, nomadic traders. So God has kept his promise, and we see this promise fulfilled here. So they come, the brothers see them, they say, hey, let's trade our brother. So they sell him for 20 shekels of silver. And there's actual ancient documents that talk about the prices of slaves during the slave trade at this time. The average price of a slave, depending upon how good they were, could be 15 to 30 shekels. So Joseph was mid-range, most likely because of his age, because he, at this point, was 17 years old. So he's 17, his brothers want to sell him. They sell him to the Ishmaelites, and they take him toward Egypt. Now Reuben, unaware of what had happened, returned to the pit, and to his great alarm, found that Joseph was not in the pit. So he tore his clothes in deep sorrow. Again, probably not because of the loss of Joseph, but because of the loss of him being able to go back to daddy and get on his good graces. He rejoined his brothers and said, the boy is not there. As for me, where shall I go to hide from my father? So there's his concern. He's not concerned about Joseph. He's concerned about his own well-being. Then they took Joseph's tunic, slaughtered a male goat, and dipped it in the blood, and they brought the multicolored tunic to their father, saying, we have found this. Please examine it and decide whether it is your son's tunic. He recognized it and said, it is my son's tunic. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without a doubt torn to pieces. So Jacob tore his clothes in grief, put on sackcloth, and mourned many days for his son. So here's what's interesting. Jacob, if we remember back to when he was a young man with his brother Esau, Jacob tricks his father with a tunic. He tricks his father by putting on his brother's tunic, putting goat skins on his arms to pretend to be his brother. But now here are Jacob's sons tricking their father with a tunic and a goat. Full circle. Such fun. So now he's put on sackcloth. He's mourning for the loss of his son. And Joseph is on his way to Egypt. Next, we go into chapter 38, which is a break from the story of Joseph to cover a story with Judah, one of the sons of Jacob, and a woman named Tamar. Now, the important part of this story is Judah, of course, is the line that leads to King David, that leads to Joseph, the father, the earthly father of Jesus, making Jesus, by being the firstborn under Joseph, royalty from the tribe of Judah, from the line of David. So, chapter 38. Now, anyone listening, if you have young children and you don't want them to hear this basically HBO drama that's about to unfold here, then come back to this later, because we are going to talk about a couple of adult themes here. But Judah and Tamar, so here we go. Now at that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a certain Adullamite named Hira. There Judah saw a daughter of Shua, a Canaanite, and he took her as his wife and lived with her. So he's married a Canaanite, which is a no-no in a sense, because oftentimes the Canaanites were very pagan. They had these temples with all these really bad things happening, and of course worshiping false gods. But he marries this one, and then he has his first son named Er. Very creative name. So she conceived and gave birth to a son, and Judah named him Then she conceived again and gave birth to a son, and named him Onan. Again she conceived and gave birth to still another son, and named him Shelah. So Judah has 3 sons with this Canaanite woman. So his first son, he goes and he finds a wife for his son, and he finds a woman named Tamar. So we see this time passing a little bit here to where his first son is now old enough to be married off. He finds the woman Tamar. Marries her, but then it says this in chapter 38, verse 7, but Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord killed him in judgment. We don't know exactly what was doing, but we can take a guess that since he was with the Canaanites, he was engaging in a lot of evil stuff. The Canaanites were, of course, sacrificing children, sacrificing people, all of these different pagan rituals, traditions, whatever. So he's dead. First son is dead. Tamar is widowed. Then Judah told Onan, the second son, go into your brother's widow and perform your duty as a brother-in-law under the marriage customs. Be her husband and raise children in the name of your brother. So this custom, if the firstborn son marries a woman and then he dies, the next son would then marry that same woman. He would impregnate her. She would have a child, but then that child would be raised under the name of the firstborn son. Because the firstborn son, we've already covered this in previous studies, that was the title. That was what you wanted, to be the firstborn, because you got everything from the father. So it was the younger brother's duty to marry this woman, impregnate her, so that she has a child that can carry on the name of the firstborn son. But Onan goes into her tent, does his business with her, but he does not impregnate her. How can we say this? He does not fully perform. He refuses to. And then it says here in verse 10, but what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord. Therefore, he killed him also in judgment. So dies, Onan dies, and now all that's left is that third son, Shelah. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow at your father's house until Shelah, my youngest son, is grown. But he was deceiving her, for he thought that if Shelah should marry her, he too might die like his brothers did. So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. But quite a while later, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. So Judah's Canaanite wife dies. He's mourning, and then he goes up to the sheep shearers at Timnah with his friend Hira, the Adullamite. Tamar was told, listen, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she removed her widow's clothes and covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself in disguise and sat in the gateway of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah had grown up, and she had not been given to him as a wife, as Judah had promised. So Judah says, my son will grow up, he'll take you as a wife. He lies, and now he's coming up to I've forgotten the name already. There's so many names in here. He's coming up to Timnah. Going to Timnah, and there's a gate on the way there named Enaim. She disguises herself to go and see this son that Judah is now bringing, knowing that he has lied. So now let's see what happens. Judah turned to her by the road and said, "Please, come, let me lie with you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, "What will you give me that you may lie with me?" Now, here's the thing. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a temple prostitute, for she had covered her face as such women did. So she's disguised as a temple prostitute. Because again, the Canaanites had these fertility rituals, all these different sex acts that they would do in their temples. So she looks like this. Judah is in mourning for his wife. He sees her. Judah is the kind of guy who wants instant fleshly gratification. He wants to sleep his sorrow away with a woman. So he goes to her, not knowing it's his daughter-in-law, and says, "Hey, let me sleep with you." And she says, "What will you give me if you sleep with me?" What's amazing is Enaim means two pools, or two ponds, or it means eyes. So he is at a place called Eyes, but he doesn't have eyes enough to see that this is his daughter-in-law in disguise. Hilarious. So she says, "What will you give me?" He answered, "I will send you a young goat from the flock." Remember, he was going up to shear his sheep and he had his goats. So he says, I'm gonna give you a goat from the flock. And she said, "Well, what will you give me as a pledge, as a deposit, until you send the goat?" He said, "What pledge shall I give to you?" She said, "Your seal and your cord and the staff that's in your hand." So a seal and the cord was basically this medallion with an imprint on it that would tell people who you were, like what family you were from, what title you had. So he has this seal that is particular to him. It was worn as either a necklace with the cord, or it was put around the waist like a belt, and his staff. So he gives her these items and then intends to send a goat and then get his items back. He sleeps with her, and it says, "And she conceived by him." This is his daughter-in-law. She conceived by him. Then she got up and left and removed her veil and put on her widow's clothing. This was the veil, because people would say, well, he slept with her. How would he not know it was her? But that was what the attire was for these temple prostitutes. They kept that facial veil on. So then she gets up, puts on her widow's clothing, and leaves. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite to get his pledge back from the woman, he was unable to find her. He asked the men of that place, "Where is the temple prostitute who was by the roadside at Enaim?" They said, "There was no prostitute there." So he returned to Judah and said, "I can't find her." Also the local men said that there's no prostitute around there. Then Judah said, "Let her keep the things," the pledge things, the cord and the seal. "Let her keep the things for herself. Otherwise we'll be a laughing stock, searching everywhere for her. After all, I sent this young goat, but you did not find her." Here's where it gets fun. About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the role of a prostitute, and she is with child because of her immorality." So he's told, hey, your daughter-in-law is pregnant because she was going around being a prostitute. This is what is hilarious. This is Judah's reaction. He says, "Bring her out here and let her be burned to death as punishment." If that is not a picture of self-righteousness, I don't know what is. He says, "Oh, Why would she do that? What an immoral thing to do. Bring her out here and let's burn her to death because of her sin, because of that immorality. When it's like, dude, you were the guy who got her pregnant, but you don't even know that. Incredible. When she was being brought out, she took the things Judah had given to her, sent them along with a message to her father-in-law saying, I am with child by the man whom these articles belong. And she added, please examine them carefully and see clearly to whom these things belong, the seal, the cord, and the staff. Judah recognized the articles and said, she has been more righteous in this matter than I, because I did not give her my son Shelah as I had promised, and Judah did not have intimate relations with her again. Yeah, I would hope not. But here is this wacky story showing the immorality of Judah, the fleshly desires that he has and how he just gives into them and creates this mess. But what's interesting is when you read on, she's pregnant with twins. And then as she's giving birth to them, I'm going to just read this from verse 28. And when she was in labor, one baby put out his hand, and the midwife took his hand and tied a scarlet thread on it, saying, this one was born first. Because remember, you got to see who the firstborn is. But he pulled his hand back in, and his brother was born first. And she said, what a breach you have made for yourself to be the firstborn. So he was named Perez, which means breach or to break forth. The second son was named Zerah. But this first son, Perez, leads to King David. He is a part of the line that leads to King David later on. So we see this this mess that's been created by Judah, but God still uses that mess to continue on this line that eventually leads to David, eventually leads to Jesus. And then we see this kind of repeating down this line with David as well, with David and Bathsheba murdering a man to get her as his wife, but then that leads to Solomon. So throughout all of this mess, God still works through it. And of course, we're going to get to the mess that Joseph was put in next. So Joseph goes to Egypt. He is sold to a man named Potiphar. He's working in Potiphar's house. We're going to skip through some of that. He is so good at what he does. He's an incredible manager that Potiphar keeps promoting him and just leaves everything in his household to the charge of Joseph. Joseph is in charge of the whole house. And then it says here in chapter 39, verse 6, so Potiphar left all that he owned in Joseph's charge, and with Joseph there, he did not need to pay attention to anything except for the food he ate. So Potiphar was chilling because Joseph was just so good at running things. But of course, then after a time, his master's wife looked at Joseph with desire, and she said, lie with me, sleep with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, look, with me in the house, my master does not concern himself with anything. He's put me in charge over everything. Everything that he owns is in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do this great evil thing against God and your husband? So we see this parallel between Joseph and Judah. Judah is after the instant gratification of his flesh. Joseph says no. Later on, let me take a sip of coffee. Then it happened one day that Joseph went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the men of the household were there in the house. Interesting. It's almost as if someone told them to go away. She comes in, says she caught Joseph by his outer robe, saying, lie with me. But he left his robe in her hand and ran and got outside the house. I want to pause on this section right here, because this is something that is so great to point out. Sometimes people who struggle with lust, which everyone struggles with lust in some respect and regard, the best thing to do is run. It even says it in scripture, run from lust. It's one of the things where it's like, don't try to fight this. Joseph didn't stay in the house and continue his job with her in there as well. He didn't say, no, I'm not going to do that. Let me go and, count this money. He got out of the house. Number one, they were alone in there. And this is a great thing to point out. There's a lot of people who say, I struggle with lust, and it's really tempting. The temptation is there heavily when I'm alone. Of course it is. Or if you're a couple and you're not married yet. And there's a great temptation when the two of you are alone. Don't get alone. Do what Joseph did. Run out into public. If you're at home by yourself and that temptation starts coming in, call somebody, text a friend, someone that you can be accountable to. Get in public. Do not stay alone. That was the smartest thing that Joseph could have done, was run out of the house. When she saw that he had left his robe in her hand and ran outside, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "Look at this, your master has brought a Hebrew into the household to mock and insult us. He came to me to lie with me, and I screamed." So, right now, what she is doing is she is getting the household on her side against Joseph. Because if she just goes straight to her husband and says, "Oh, Joseph tried to sleep with me," whatever, then her husband may not completely believe her. But if she gets all of the men of the house on her side and then goes to her husband, she has a better chance of convincing him that Joseph did this. But what she does is she says, "Look at this, your master," trying to get them against him. "Look at this, your master has brought a Hebrew into the household." So she's bringing his heritage, where he has come from, the people group he belongs to, into it. She said, "Look at this dirty Hebrew that's been brought in here. How dare we have a Hebrew in this house? He's mocking us. This can't stand." So then, when he heard me screaming, he left his robe with me and ran outside the house. So she left Joseph's outer robe beside her until his master came home. Then she told her husband the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you brought among us came to me to mock and insult me." Then, as soon as I raised my voice and screamed, he left the robe with me and ran outside the house. So Potiphar is put in a bad situation. If he doesn't do something with Joseph, number one, he's going to look weak. He's going to look like he doesn't care about his wife. And thirdly, because she has gotten everyone on her side against Joseph for being a Hebrew, if he doesn't do something to Joseph, then they're all going to be like, "Oh, this dude's a joke. He cares about this Hebrew more than he cares about his own people. What's going on?" So he sends Joseph to prison. Joseph is in prison for a while, and eventually he's put in charge of the prison because, again, he is so incredible at what he does. So at this point now, Joseph is in charge of the prison. He's managing things. He is 28 years old now. He is in prison, and then it says here in verse 23, "The warden paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's care because the Lord was with him. Whatever Joseph did, the Lord made prosper." So because God was with Joseph and God gave Joseph the ability to manage and to do what he needed to do, again, he is promoted. And this is another thing. When someone lies about you, when something happens where you are taken out of a place that you are comfortable in, it could look bad. And, it may be a bad situation. Joseph was comfortable in Potiphar's house. He was managing the whole thing. He was living very comfortably there. Then he's lied about and he's put in prison. And it looks like this is a downgrade, which sure, yeah, it looks like that. But because he trusted God and he had the favor of God with him, now he's not in charge of just a household. He's in charge of an entire prison. He's still in prison, which is a downer, but he's in charge. He can do whatever he wants in that prison. That's what's so beautiful about God is even though something bad happens, even if you're lied about, even if, things don't work out in the place that you're comfortable, God has a plan to bring you out of it. And then he has another plan, which we're going to get to. So in chapter 40, we have a cupbearer and a baker who are thrown in prison, and they have dreams. They both have a dream in the same night, and it's their own personal dream. Joseph is 28 at this point, and then he interprets their dreams. He basically says you can go read the dreams for yourself. He says to the baker, in 3 days, you're going to die. You're going to be executed. And he says to the cupbearer, in 3 days, Pharaoh is going to restore you back to where you belong in the palace. So then it happens, but he tells the cupbearer, he says, hey, when you go back to Pharaoh, remember me, put in a good word for me. And of course, the guy forgets. He goes back, and a couple of years pass, and at this point, Joseph is now 30, and the Pharaoh in chapter 41 has his dreams. The first dream, coffee break. The first dream is 7 healthy, fat, strong-looking cows come out of the Nile and they start grazing. And then 7 sickly, skinny-looking cows come out of the Nile and then they eat the healthy cows. He has another dream where wheat's growing and then 7 stalks of wheat, and then 7 more stalks that look diseased, unhealthy, and dry, grow, and then they overtake the healthy wheat, and they choke it out and kill it. So Pharaoh is freaking out. No one can tell him what his dreams mean. He's asking the magicians, which the magicians of Egypt were not like illusionists. They weren't going around pulling rabbits out of hats. The magicians were there to basically, they were like cultic officials who would interpret omens, signs, stars, all of this stuff. But they can't tell Pharaoh anything. They're like, we have no clue what this means. And then this is when the cupbearer remembers Joseph. He says, hey, Pharaoh, there's this guy. He interpreted these dreams of me and the baker in prison. He could probably help. So they go and they get Joseph. Joseph is shaved. He's cleaned up. And then he is presented to Pharaoh. So we're going to pick it up in verse 14, chapter 41. Then Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph, and they hurriedly brought him out of the dungeon and went to Joseph, shaved him, changed his clothes, making it presentable to come to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. And I have heard it said about you that you can understand a dream and interpret it. Joseph answers Pharaoh, it is not in me to interpret the dream. God, not I, will give Pharaoh a favorable answer through me. So, Joseph, when he's a 17-year-old, has these dreams, and he's prideful about it. He's arrogant. He's like, hey, guess what? I have this dream, and I'm going to rule over you guys. It's going to be awesome. I'm the best that there is. Now we see a different Joseph. We see a humble Joseph who says, it's not me, it's God through me that will do it. If you had taken 17-year-old Joseph and put him in this same scenario, I am sure without a doubt that Joseph would be like, yeah, sure, I can interpret this for you. I'm awesome. They call me the dream man. I'm so cool. But now he is humble. He has trusted God through this process. Pharaoh tells him the dreams, and then Joseph interprets them, says, hey, you're going to have 7 years of plenty. It's going to be really prosperous. And then you're going to have 7 years of famine. It's going to be really, really bad. So you need to prepare for it, blah, blah, blah. So then Pharaoh hears this. And then Joseph says, let Pharaoh take action to appoint overseers and officials over the land and set aside 1/5 of the produce of the entire land of Egypt in the 7 years of abundance. Let them gather as a tax all of the 1/5 of the food of these good years that are coming and store them up under the direction and the authority of Pharaoh, and let them guard the food in fortified granaries in the cities. That food shall be put in storage as a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine and hunger which will occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land and the people will not be ravaged during the famine. Now the plan all seemed good to Pharaoh and to all of his servants. So now, in verse 38, so Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this, a man equal to Joseph, in whom is the divine spirit of God? So Joseph has explained the dream. Not only that, but he has given a strategy in how to face this famine. And Pharaoh is so impressed. He says, hey, there's no one like this. All of you magicians, all of you officials, none of you could help. This guy has literally done everything. Who else is like this guy? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since your God has shown you all of this, there is no one as discerning and clear-headed and wise as you. You shall have charge over my house, and all my people shall be governed according to your word, and pay respect to you with reverence, submission, and obedience. Only in matters of the throne will I be greater than you in Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you in charge over all of the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and dressed him in official vestments of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in his second chariot. I love that. Pharaoh is like, you can have my second chariot. It's like, you can have my second Lamborghini. Ride in his second chariot, and runners proclaiming before him, attention, bow the knee. And he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, though I am Pharaoh, yet without your permission shall no man raise his hand to do anything or set his foot to go anywhere. In all the land of Egypt, all classes of people shall submit to your authority. Then Pharaoh named Joseph Zaphanath Paneah, which, when we translate that, most likely means God speaks, he lives. And then Pharaoh gave him Asenath, the daughter of, well, we won't go into that, but he gives Joseph a wife who is the daughter of an Egyptian priest. So what this is the Hebrews were separate from the Egyptians. What Pharaoh does here is he has now integrated Joseph fully in as an Egyptian. And by giving him this wife, who is the daughter of one of the Egyptian priests, now he is like set. He's basically, it'd be like saying, okay, you are now an American, welcome to America, but I'm going to give you Angelina Jolie as a wife. I'm going to give you this celebrity. I'm going to give you Taylor Swift. No one wants her, but that's okay. I'm going to give you this celebrity woman as your wife. You're fully American now. He is now in Egypt, second to Pharaoh, fully integrated. They begin the process of storing up everything for the 7 abundant years. And then he has 2 sons. So now we're in verse 51. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, which means causing to forget. For he said, God has made me forget all of my trouble and hardships and all the sorrows of loss from my father's household. Remember that for later. He names his son after him forgetting about all of the sorrow of his life. And then he has another son. He named his second son Ephraim, fruitfulness, for God has caused me to be fruitful and very successful in the land of my suffering. So he has these two sons. He's fully integrated. They're working to collect all of this food. And then the famine hits. And that is where we will pick it up in chapter 42. So 20 years have passed since he has seen his brothers. Chapter 42, verse 1. Now when Jacob, Israel, learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why are you staring at one another in bewilderment and not taking action?" He said, "I have heard there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some grain for us so that we may live and not die of starvation." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, with his brothers, for he said, "I'm afraid that some harm or injury may come to him." So remember, Benjamin is son number 12, the second son of Rachel, who was Jacob's favorite. So Joseph is dead to Jacob. So all he has left of Rachel is Benjamin. So he is very protective of Benjamin. Now Joseph was the ruler over the land, and he was the one who sold grain to all the people of the land. And Joseph's half-brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces to the ground. Here is the fulfillment of the dream. When Joseph saw this, when Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. But hiding his identity, he treated them as strangers and spoke harshly to them. So he is in Egyptian garb. He has the Egyptian makeup on. He looks completely different. And then he speaks using an interpreter. So he speaks to the interpreter speaks to his brothers speak to the interpreter, even though Joseph can understand what they're saying. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but hiding his identity, he treated them as strangers and spoke to them harshly. He said to them, "Where have you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." He said to them, "You are spies. You have come with malicious purpose to observe the undefended parts of our land." But they said to him, "No, my lord, for your servants have only come to buy food. We are all the sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies." Then he said to them, "No, you have come to see the undefended parts of the land." But they said, "Your servants are 12 brothers in all, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. Please listen, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no longer alive." Joseph said to them, "It is as I said, you are spies. In this way you shall be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you back home and let him bring your brother here, while the rest of you remain confined, so that your words may be tested to see whether there is truth in your story, or else by the life of Pharaoh you are certainly spies." Then Joseph put them in prison for 3 days. Now Joseph said to them on the third day, "Do this, and you may live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined in your place here in prison. But as for the rest of you, go, carry grain for the famine to your household, but bring your youngest brother to me, so your words will be verified and you will not die." And they did so. And they said to one another, "Truly, we are guilty regarding our brother Joseph, because we saw the distress and anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us to let him go, yet we would not listen to his cry. So this distress and anguish has come on us." Reuben answered them, "Did I not tell you, do not sin against the boy, and you would not listen? Now the accounting for his blood is required of us, for we are guilty of his death." They did not know that Joseph understood their conversation, because he spoke to them through an interpreter. He turned away from his brothers and left the room and wept. Then he returned and talked with them, and took Simeon from them and bound him in Egypt. So, a couple of things. He's hearing their entire conversation, talking about him, saying, like, we've brought this upon ourselves. Like, this is because of what we did to Joseph. And then it says, he left the room and wept. What's interesting is, from his moment of arriving in Egypt up until now, it never says that he has wept or complained. Now, we don't know for sure, but the scripture says that he did not weep or complain until this point And let's not forget, he named one of his sons forgotten, because he has forgotten what has happened. He has come out of that and said, you know what? It's in the past. I've forgotten about it. Life is great here. God has done an amazing thing. But now he sees his brothers and he has to leave the room to go weep. He comes back. Then Joseph gave orders privately that their bags should be filled with grain, and that every man's money that was used to pay for the grain must be put back in the sacks, and that provision be given to them for the journey. And this was done. So he keeps Simeon. He says, the rest of you go back, bring back your younger brother, and then you can have Simeon back. I want to make sure you're not spies. Then their money is returned in their sacks. They go on their way back to Canaan. They stop at an inn and they open their sacks to feed their donkeys, and they realize our money is in our bags. Oh no. So they start panicking, and we're just going to skip a little bit further here. They get back home. They tell Jacob, their father, what happened. And then Jacob says to them, you have bereaved me by causing the loss of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and you would take Benjamin from me. All these things are working against me. So they come back, they tell him, hey, this Egyptian guy has kept Simeon, but he wants to see Benjamin. And so Jacob's reaction is kind of like that scene in Dumb and Dumber. We got no food, we got no jobs, our pets' heads are falling off. But he says, first Joseph, now Simeon, and then Benjamin. What are you guys doing? Everything is against me. Then Reuben spoke to his father, you may put my 2 sons to death if I do not bring Benjamin back to you. Again, I don't understand Reuben. Reuben to me is a strange man, because like, you're putting your 2 sons up to be killed instead of yourself. Now, mind you, he's basically offering my sons for your sons, so sure. But again, what an odd thing. If I don't bring Benjamin back to you, put him in my care, and I will return him to you. But Jacob said, my son shall not go to Egypt with you, for his brother is dead, and he alone is left of Rachel's children. If any harm or accident should happen to him on the journey you are taking, then you will bring my gray hair down to Sheol, the place of the dead, in sorrow. So he's basically saying, I will be so stricken with grief that my grief will follow me into the afterlife. You can't take him. So then in chapter 43, the famine continues. And then Jacob finally says, you can take Benjamin. But then he makes this deal. In chapter 43, verse 11, he says, then their father Jacob said this to them, if it must be so, then do this, take some of the choicest products of the land in your sacks and carry it as a present of tribute to the man representing Pharaoh. A little balm, a little honey, aromatic spices, gum resin, pistachio nuts, and almonds. Take double the amount of money with you and take back the money that was returned in the opening of your sacks. Perhaps it was an oversight. Take your brother Benjamin also. Get up, go to the man, and may God Almighty grant you compassion and favor before the man, so that he will release to you your other brothers Simeon and Benjamin. And as for me, if I am bereaved by my children, Joseph, Simeon, and Benjamin, I am bereaved. He's basically saying, if it is what it is. So now they go on their journey back, and we now have the moment where Joseph sees Benjamin. So this is verse 16. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the steward of his house, bring the men into my house and kill an animal and make a meal ready, for the men will dine with me at noon. So the man did as Joseph said and brought the men into Joseph's house. The men were afraid because they were brought into Joseph's house and expecting the worst. They said, it is because of the money that was returned in our sacks the first time we came that we are being brought in, so that he may find a reason to accuse us and assail us and take us as slaves and seize our donkeys. So they approached the steward of Joseph's house and talked with him at the entrance of the house and said, oh, my lord, we indeed came down here the first time to buy food, but then when we arrived, we opened our sacks and then all of our money was in there. We're so sorry. Here it is. Please take it back." But the steward encouraged them and said, "Peace be to you. Do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has miraculously given you treasure in your sacks. I already have the money which you paid us." Then he brought Simeon out to them. Again, this is all a part of Joseph's plan. When Joseph came home, they were brought into the house to him. They gave him the present, the tribute from their father, and then they bowed to the ground before him. He asked them about their well-being and said, "Is your old father well, of whom you spoke? Is he still alive?" And they answered, "Your servant, our father, is in good health. He is still alive." And they bowed down before Joseph in respect. And he looked up and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's only other son, and said, "Is this your youngest brother, of whom you spoke to me?" And Joseph said, "God be gracious to you and show you favor, my son." Then Joseph hurried out of the room because his heart was deeply touched over his brother, and he sought privacy to weep. So he entered his chambers and wept there. So now we see again Joseph weeping because of the emotions that he is feeling. Remember, it's been 20 years. He washes his face, comes back out, and then they start eating, but then Joseph's brothers were sat elsewhere, and Joseph ate by himself, but he sent portions from his own table, but he was giving Benjamin 5 times the amount of portions as his other brothers. Now, a couple of things. They had to eat dinner separately because it was actually considered an abomination for the Egyptians to eat with the Hebrews, which again goes back to Potiphar's wife saying, "Oh, he's a Hebrew." There's this separation. And now that Joseph is fully integrated as an Egyptian, he is not going to eat with his Hebrew brothers. But he sends Benjamin 5 times the amount. I like to think he was continuing to test his brothers, because he was like, he loves Benjamin. Benjamin is his blood brother. But I think it was also that thing of, let's see what they do when their brother gets more than them. So now chapter 44. And he commanded the steward of his house, saying, "Fill the men's sacks with food, as much as they can carry, and put every man's grain money back in the mouth of the sacks. Put my personal cup, the silver cup, in the mouth of the sack of the youngest, with his grain money." And the steward did just as Joseph told him. So they load up the sacks with grain. Joseph says, "Put my personal cup in Benjamin's sack." And then he makes this plan with his steward. He tells his steward, "Hey, when they are leaving, go catch up with them, and I want you to say, 'Why have you repaid evil to us for the good that we've paid you? Is this not my Lord's drinking cup, and the one which he uses for divination? You have done a great unforgivable wrong in doing this.'" So the steward says, "Okay, I'll say that." What he means by divination is he tells the brothers that he is able to foretell the future. Which is funny, because then whenever they come back, he references it. But the steward catches up with them, and then the brothers say this, "Please remember the money which we found in the mouths of the sacks, and we brought it back to you from the land of Canaan. We're not thieves. Is it likely that we would steal silver or gold from your master's house? With whomever your servants... with whomever the master's cup is found, let him die, and the rest of us will be my Lord's slaves." And the steward said, "Now let it be as you say. He with whom the cup is found will be my slave, but the rest of you shall be blameless." So they say, "Hey, whoever has the cup," because they don't think anyone has it. Like, "Whoever has the cup, you can kill him, and then we'll just be your slaves." They don't think they have the cup, so they're like, "Hey man, we swear." But then the steward says, no, just the one who has the cup will be my slave, and the rest of you are free to go. And then the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. Then they tore their clothes in grief. After each man had loaded his donkey again, they returned back to the city. When Judah and his brothers came to Joseph's house, he was still there, and he fell to the ground before him. Joseph spoke harshly to him. What is this thing that you have done? Do you not realize that such a man as I can indeed practice divination and foretell everything you do with outside knowledge of it? So Judah said, what can we say, my lord? How can we repay? Or how can we clear ourselves, since God has exposed the sin and the guilt of your servants? Behold, we are the Lord's slaves, or we are my Lord's slaves, the rest of us, as well as he with whom the cup is found. But Joseph said, far be it from me that I should do that. But the man in whose hand the cup has been found, he will be my servant, and the rest of you will get up and go in peace to your father. Then Judah approached him and said, oh, my lord, please let your servant say a word to you in private, and do not let your anger blaze against your servant, for you are equal to Pharaoh. So I speak to him, or speak directly to you as if to him. My lord asked his servant, saying, have you a father or a brother? We said to my lord, we have an old father and a young brother named Benjamin. Then he basically explains to him, Joseph is dead. Benjamin means the world to my dad. Please take me, let Benjamin go. Let me skim through this. Yeah, so he basically explains to him, my father, it will literally kill my father if Benjamin does not come back with us. And he says in 33, now therefore, please let your servant Judah remain here instead of Benjamin. I will be a slave. Let him go back home with his brothers. And then it says in chapter 45, then Joseph could not control himself any longer in front of all those who attended him, and he called out, have everyone leave me. So no man stood there when Joseph revealed himself to his brothers. Joseph wept aloud, and the Egyptians who had just left him heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard of it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers were speechless, for they were stunned and dismayed by the fact that they were in Joseph's presence. And Joseph said to his brothers, please come closer to me. And they approached him. And he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me ahead of you to save life and preserve our family. So he reveals himself to his brothers. I am Joseph. He weeps with them. And then he tells them, go back, get our father, get our families, and bring them here, live in Egypt. And it says in verse 14, then he embraced his brother Benjamin's neck and wept. Benjamin wept on his back. He kissed all his brothers and wept on them, and afterward his brothers talked with him. When the news was heard in Pharaoh's house that Joseph's brothers had come, it pleased Pharaoh and his servants. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, tell your brothers, do this, load your animals and return to the land of Canaan without delay. Get your father and your household and come back to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will eat the fat, the finest produce of the land. Now you, brothers of Joseph, are ordered by Pharaoh, do this, take a wagon from the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father, and come. Do not be concerned with your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. So he says, come, live here, we'll give you whatever you need. So they go back, they see their father, Jacob, and they say to him, Joseph is still alive, and indeed he is ruler over all the land of Egypt. But Jacob was stunned, and his heart almost stopped beating because he did not believe them, when they told him everything that Joseph had said to them. And when he saw the wagons which Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. And Jacob said, it is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go see him before I die. So then, in chapter 46, they moved to Egypt. On the way there, God speaks to Jacob in a vision and says, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here I am. And the Lord said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you and your descendants a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you and your people up again. and Joseph will put his hand on your eyes to close them at the time of your death. So, in this moment, God is reminding him of the promise that they would be a great nation, the same promise that he made to Abraham. But then he says, don't be afraid, I'll go with you. And then I will bring you up out of Egypt again. So now God is promising what happens in Exodus. Of course, Jacob doesn't know that they would become oppressed by the Egyptians, but God is making his promise that he would bring them up out of Egypt and return them back to the promised land. So then we have the list of everyone who came to Egypt. Then I'll just go down to verse 27. And the sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were 2. All of the persons of the house of Jacob, including Jacob and Joseph and his sons who came into Egypt, were 70. Now Jacob sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to direct him to Goshen. So Goshen was the land that was set apart for Joseph and his family to live in. So there's a couple of reasons why this might have been done. Joseph wanted them in their own area, in their own land, because it lessened the likelihood of Jacob's family being absorbed by the Egyptians. So Joseph had already become an Egyptian, but he wanted this land for them so they could be separate, so they could still be Hebrews with their own practices, their own culture, their own religious freedoms. So they get the land of Goshen. And then Joseph has a conversation with him and says, hey, when Pharaoh asks what you guys do, you need to tell him that you take care of livestock, that you're shepherds, and that your fathers were shepherds, your grandfathers were shepherds. And there's this strategy as to why he tells them to say this. So chapter 47, they're in Goshen. And then Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. And if you know of any men of ability among them, put them in charge of my livestock. So they get their own land, but it's important that they are in charge of livestock, because shepherds and people who cared for animals like that were kind of outcast from the Egyptians. They would have been very separate. Now, there's multiple reasons behind this. It could have been because of animal sacrifices. We don't fully know, but there was that separation. So Joseph is ensuring, number one, that his family would remain Hebrew. And number two, they would have their own space, their own land. And number three, we'll see what happens with the livestock. This is chapter 47, verse 15. And when the money was exhausted in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, give us food. Why should we die before your very eyes? For the money is gone. Joseph said, give up your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock, since the money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and he gave them food in exchange for the horses and the flocks and the herds and the donkeys, and he supplied them with food in exchange for all of their livestock that year. So his family, Jacob, is put in charge of the livestock. And then Joseph says, hey, everyone, you can trade your livestock for the food. So now his family is off to a fantastic start. They've got all this livestock that they're taking care of for Pharaoh. They're in a good place. When that year was ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, we will not hide from my lord the fact that our money is spent. My lord also has our herds and our livestock. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes? Both we and our land, buy us and our land in exchange for the food, and we and our land will be servants to Pharaoh, and give us seed to plant, that we may live and not die, and that the land may also not be desolate. So, all the land became Pharaoh's, except for the land that Jacob and his family was on. Then Joseph said to the people, "Look, today I have brought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now, here is the seed for you, and you shall plant the land. At harvest time you will reap the increase, and you will give 1/5 of it to Pharaoh. 4/5 will be for your own use, for your seeds, for your fields, for your food, and for your household." And they said, "You have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants." Now the people of Israel, Jacob's family, lived in the country of Egypt in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions and acquired property there and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. So this is the 7 years of the famine and after. Pharaoh now owns all the land of Egypt. He owns the people of Egypt. He owns all of the livestock. The livestock's being taken care of by Jacob and his family. Jacob and his family have their own land. Pharaoh has become head honcho, like he owns everything. But then you have Jacob's family growing, multiplying, and they are coming into their own wealth in the land of Goshen, which leads to them being oppressed later on, and we'll get to that. Now, Jacob is getting close to dying. He asks Joseph to make him a promise to not bury him in Egypt. He wants to be buried where his fathers are buried in Hebron in this cave. And then Joseph says yes. Now in chapter 48, we see Jacob's last days. And we see him give a blessing to his sons in chapter 49. But in 48, Jacob blesses Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh, who are Joseph's sons. But Ephraim receives from Jacob the blessing of the firstborn, even though he wasn't the firstborn unto Joseph, which, again, we're seeing Jacob, who stole the birthright and the firstborn privilege from Esau. He is now giving that firstborn privilege to Ephraim instead of Manasseh. But then Joseph tries to correct him and be like, "Oh no, he's the firstborn." But Jacob's like, "No, I know what I'm doing." And what's interesting is Ephraim and Manasseh both become a tribe of Israel. And Ephraim, his tribe, the Ephraimites, were actually paramount in the taking of Jericho with Joshua. They were a prominent tribe during that time, but then that prominence is later on replaced by the tribe of Judah. But that prominence comes from this firstborn blessing that is given to them from Jacob. And he basically elevates his grandsons, Manasseh and Ephraim, to the status of full sons. So he basically puts them on par with Reuben and Simeon. So really great blessing for the sons of Joseph. But now in 49, Jacob is about to die. He calls his sons together and then he blesses them. So I won't go over each blessing, just a couple of them. So we have Reuben, who is the firstborn. But Reuben, remember, slept with his father's wife, Bilhah, the maidservant. And Jacob knew about it, but didn't really do anything about it until this point. He says, "Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, the beginning of my strength and vigor, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. That should have been your birthright. But unstable and reckless and boiling over like water in sinful lust, you shall not excel or have the preeminence of the firstborn. Because you went up to your father's bed with Bilhah, you defiled it." And then he moves on to Simeon and Levi. So he basically just says, "You're my firstborn, but you're not getting any of this." And then with Simeon and Levi, he focuses kind of on their violent disposition. But this is going back to their treatment of the men of Shechem, who they massacred because of the humiliation of their sister Dinah. We Remember that from back. So he gives them a blessing, but kind of focuses on their violent nature. And then we go to Judah. And this is what he says to Judah. Remember, this is the line that leads to David and then leads to Jesus. Judah, a lion's cub. With the prey, my son, you have gone up high on the mountain. He stooped down low and he crouched like a lion. And like a lion, who dares rouse him? The scepter of royalty shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh, the Messiah, the peaceful one, comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. So basically, there's, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, all of these different things in this blessing. Very important blessing. But then he moves on to his other sons, like Dan, which Samson comes from the tribe of Dan, and then he says, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. So every single one of these blessings is a foreshadowing of what is to come for the nation of Israel through all of these sons. But then we get the longest blessing with Joseph. So let's find that blessing right here. Joseph is a fruitful bough, a main branch of the vine, a fruitful bough by a spring, a well, a fountain. Its branches run over the wall, influencing others. The skilled archers have bitterly attacked and provoked him. They have shot at him and harassed him, but his bow remained firm and steady in the strength that does not fail. For his arms were made strong and agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob, by the name of the shepherd of the stone of Israel, by the God of your father who will help you, and by the Almighty who blesses you, with blessings of the heavens above, blessings lying in the deep that couches beneath, blessings of the nursing breast and the fertile womb. The blessings of your father are greater than the blessings of my ancestors Abraham and Isaac. Up to the utmost bound of the everlasting hills, they shall be on the head of Joseph, even on the crown of the head of him who was the distinguished one, and the one who is prince among, separate from his brothers. So in saying this long blessing for Joseph, he confirms that he has a special standing among his brothers, but also he is giving him that firstborn blessing in this. And then he goes on and he blesses Benjamin. Benjamin gets a short one. He says, Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he devours the prey, and at night he divides the spoils. So he's basically saying Benjamin is going to be a tribe of these ruthless, fantastic warriors. Also, King Saul came from the tribe of Benjamin, and the Apostle Paul also came from the tribe of Benjamin, which is why I love Paul. He's a ravenous wolf. So now we get into chapter 50, which is going to be the last chapter of Genesis. Jacob dies. Joseph honors what he had asked for, buries him where he wants to be buried. And then his brothers, Joseph's brothers, fear for their lives. They're like, oh, our dad is dead. Maybe Joseph is going to use this time to take his revenge upon us. What are we going to do? So they basically came up with this lie, and they went to Joseph and they said, your father commanded us before he died, saying, you are to say to Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the transgressions of your brothers and their sins, for they did you wrong. Now please forgive them. Forgive the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers went and fell down before him in confession. And they said, behold, we are your servants, your slaves. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? Vengeance is his, not mine. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present outcome, that many people would be kept alive as they are to this day. So now do not be afraid. I will provide for you, and I will support you and your little ones. So he comforted them, giving them encouragement and hope, and spoke to them with kindness to their hearts. So here's the thing about forgiveness. This is what's amazing. Joseph hasn't complained. He hasn't cried. He hasn't had, any of these things happening. He hasn't said like, oh, woe is me, poor me. And then he sees his brothers after 20 years and weeps. He has all these moments of weeping with his brothers. And this is what is so great about forgiveness. If I were in Joseph's position and I saw my brothers for the first time, I cannot guarantee you that I wouldn't have had them killed. That's just me being honest. Or like, hey, you guys are going to be slaves now. Congratulations. But he has forgiveness in his heart toward his brothers. But the thing is, forgiveness is not just a one and done thing. It's not a one-time thing. That's something that we oftentimes can tend to picture in the church is like, hey, you need to forgive that person. It's like, I did. And it's like, yeah, but you're still wishing death upon them. So you need to forgive them again, because forgiveness is a process. I had to go through the process of forgiving my father. And it took years. And I thought, I forgave him once. That's enough. But there was always still this anger. And it wasn't until it was explained to me that forgiveness is a process. And even Jesus says, you will forgive 70 times 7. So it's not just a one and done thing. The best way I've ever heard it described is you need to have the bum bag of forgiveness, the fanny pack of forgiveness that you are constantly reaching into, and you're pulling out forgiveness whenever you feel like you need it. And then as you continue doing that, the amount of times that you will have to forgive somebody becomes less and less and less and less until you get to the point where you have truly forgiven, because whereas before you might have wished death upon the person, you might have hated the person, but then you get to the point where it's like, you know what? I've forgiven them, and I really hope that they encounter God in a massive way. I hope that they come to know Jesus, and I want them to be blessed. That's when you know that you have truly forgiven. And we see that in Joseph. He says, I will provide for you and support you and your little ones. He comforted them, giving them encouragement and hope, and spoke to them with kindness. That's when you know you've forgiven. And what's crazy is Joseph could have easily had them killed. But the thing is, if he had had them killed, that ends the line that leads to David. That ends the line that leads to Jesus. That's the level of this decision that he could have made. And God would have still found a way to do whatever he wanted to do. But the promise that God made for that line to produce King David, to produce Jesus, was fulfilled through the forgiveness that Joseph had for his brothers. Absolutely incredible story of forgiveness. And we'll wrap it up here with the death of Joseph. It's kind of quiet toward the end after the famine and everything, because we see Joseph having grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and he ends up dying at a ripe old age. So we'll read this here. Now Joseph lived in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. Also the children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were born and raised on Joseph's knee. So then Joseph dies, but he says, I want my bones to be buried in Canaan. So they embalm Joseph. His bones are kept in Egypt. But then, once the Exodus happens, Moses actually fulfills this request by taking the bones of Joseph and then bringing them to Canaan. So to wrap everything up, I just want to quickly go through the family line with a chart so you can kind of see it, how the tribes of Israel are formed. So if you see here, whoop, camera's freaking out. 1 second. Stay there. Okay. So we have Abraham. Abraham, of course, has his wife, Sarah, and from them comes Isaac. And then from Hagar, we have Ishmael, which makes the Ishmaelites. And then Isaac marries Rebekah, has Jacob and Esau. Esau produces the Edomites. And then Jacob marries Leah, marries Rachel. From Leah, we get the firstborn, which is Reuben. And then second is Simeon. Third is Levi. Fourth is Judah. And then Rachel, of course, gets mad. She's like, I want children. Here, have my maid. And then the maid gives birth to the fifth son, Dan. And then the sixth one, Naphtali. And then Leah does the same thing. Here's my maidservant, Zilpah. Zilpah gives birth to number 7, which is Gad. Number 8, which is Asher. And then back to Leah. Leah has number 9, Issachar. Number 10, Zebulun. And then finally, Rachel has our man, Joseph, son number 11, and then number 12, Benjamin, and then Joseph, of course, has Manasseh and Ephraim. And this is the tribes of Israel, the children of Israel. And then, of course, they are in Egypt for 430 years. And part of that time is in slavery and oppression by the Egyptians, which we will get to in Exodus. But to answer the question that I've always had, what happened? How did they go from, being in this good place in Goshen with all this stuff to suddenly they're slaves? Well, it's 400 some odd years. So you get different pharaohs rising up in Egypt. And remember, Pharaoh was now in charge of everything. The land was his, the grain was his, the people were his. So now several pharaohs down the line, you have a new pharaoh who doesn't remember any of the things that happened with Joseph, doesn't know anything about it, but he sees, okay, we have Egypt, we have the Egyptians, and then we have these Hebrews over here who have all this stuff, who have this land. What happens if they rise up against us? Because they very well could, and they could take over Egypt. How do we solve this problem? Let's enslave them. So that's what happens, and that is what we will go into next time in the book of Exodus. That wraps it up for the book of Genesis. I'm so glad that you guys have been listening along and studying. Remember, go back and read those chapters for yourself. The Bible is an amazing story, filled with so many different things that ties into different books. It's just absolutely amazing. I hope that you guys are falling in love with the scripture like I have. We will see you next time on our Bible study.